Hi, my name is Gavin Henning. It's an honor to speak to you today on the topic of professional development of student affairs in the United States. Before we begin, let me share a little bit about my background. So I'm currently a professor of higher education at New England College, which is a small private liberal arts institution in New Hampshire. And I've been doing this now for 10 years. And I also direct two graduate programs. One is our Master of Science in Higher Education Administration, and the second is our Doctor of Education programs. I have 30 years of experience in higher education, 20 which are in student affairs, and those are the 20 before I became a full-time faculty member. I was president of ACPA College Student Educators International from 2015 to 2016, and then also president of the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education 2017 to 2019. There are four goals for my talk today. The first is to discuss the challenges for student affairs during the COVID-19 pandemic, because this lays the groundwork for the foundation for what professional development looked like during COVID, and then also what professional development looked like after the pandemic, and really kind of what it will be as we move forward. And I was also asked to talk a little bit about staffing in student affairs, so I'll address that at the end. So first, let's discuss the challenges. The biggest one really were the precautions that were needed during that pandemic, which we still are using right now as well. You know, the faculty and staff knew very little about COVID-19, and we were learning it as the country was learning it, as the world was learning the elements of that. And so just having that knowledge and trying to find that knowledge was really needed so we could effectively address this work. And because COVID really had an impact on both in-class and out-of-class, really the student affairs folks were the ones who were tasked with addressing this because they handle most of those types of situations on campus. The switch to remote learning had an impact because students were no longer on campus. And so student affairs folks had to figure out how do we deal with virtual services? How do we provide services that we would normally provide in person and do that remotely? All of the testing that was needed and the frequency of testing was typically coordinated and managed by student affairs staff. They were the ones who were also responsible for identifying who was tested and who hadn't been tested. They were typically the ones managing any policies regarding masking, as well as monitoring and addressing any issues who needed to be isolated when students were on campus. So that really had a huge impact on everything. It disrupted all the student affairs work here in the United States, as I'm sure it does around the world, because all of the efforts of student affairs staff were put towards COVID precautions. And if they weren't, just simply the disruption that happened impacted the way student affairs staff went about work. The biggest challenge was really not having students on campus. You know, student affairs staff typically interact with students when they're on campus and, personally, one-on-one and in small groups. So having students not be on campus any longer really disrupted things and changed the way that student affairs was delivered. So we had to figure out how to involve students remotely. There were not workshops or presentations, student organizations were not meeting in person. Even the one-on-one interactions that staff would have with students were not happening in the same way. Fortunately, we have technology such as Zoom and other things, which we didn't 10 years ago, that allows for some of that connection, but it still was different. There was this lack of community, not only because people couldn't get together in one place, but there just wasn't that those conversations that happen naturally or organically before or after an organization meeting, or just what happened in the student union or the student center. And so this lack of community really had an impact on students. Students felt lonely. They had limited sense of belonging because they were not connected in the same interpersonal way. Of course, there was Zoom, there was FaceTime, other virtual video options, is that social media, but still it didn't replace those interpersonal connections that folks had when they were in the same space. There are also a lot of missed learning opportunities because a lot of learning that happens outside the classroom happens in some of these interpersonal situations. If it's a one-on-one conversation with students, if it's during the training for a student organization, providing a program for students, a lot of the education happened in these spaces that no longer existed. So student affairs staff had to figure out how are they going to provide this learning. We could certainly do workshops remotely, so that provided some solution, but still that informal or organic conversations that would help, typically from an advising perspective, weren't able to happen in the same way. They were more structured and more formalized than they had been in the past. And then staff were really realizing there were increased inequities on campus. For a lot of students, this is their home, living in the residence halls. They were getting food because they had a meal plan. They had access to healthcare through the student health center, access to technology such as computers and reliable internet. But when students weren't on campus, they didn't have access to this. And so we realized that students were missing housing, or at least their own space. They may be sharing space with multiple family members. They didn't have the same access to food or healthcare that they had in the past when they were on campus. So this made us realize there's a lot more inequities with our students than we realized before, and the campus environment provided a lot of that and a lot of those needs that students had. The other thing was, as I mentioned earlier, the work of student affairs changed dramatically. So not only did they have to learn more about COVID and how we address COVID, but that was on top of all of their other work they had to do. So while there were some campuses in the past, you've had outbreaks of flu and similar diseases such as that, nobody had any experience in this widespread pandemic and a pandemic that had such a disruptive effect on campus life. And so that was a whole new learning, and that caused a lot of stress around that. Student affairs folks who were used to interacting with students on campus had to figure out how to deal with this extended virtual environment. I think we all had hoped that this remote learning would be temporary, just for maybe a couple of months, maybe for the end of the 2018-2019 academic year, but then it took over for the whole next year, and now even this past fall. So student affairs staff had to figure out how to manage within that virtual setting. And then when students came back to campus this year, how do we reintegrate people? What are the new practices that we needed to engage in? How do we manage this new normal? And as mentioned, lots of new skills and knowledge were needed. So emergency management was something that some folks had experience in, but everybody needed more experience in. And the situation kept on changing. The rules regarding precautions that needed to be taken, different institutions had different policies. So there was this constant adaptation of student affairs work to whatever the new policy and the new environment was. And so that really caused staff to be underprepared and overworked. And mental health issues really kind of rose to the forefront, not just for students, but for faculty and staff alike. Stress was really high for everybody because there was a huge disruption in all of our lives. For folks who had family at home and they had to stay home or manage them, or their kids were home from school, but they needed to be working on campus, they had to figure out how to manage all that. So that caused a lot of stress for staff. Increased anxiety, just because nobody really been through this before. Particularly early on, the concern about the serious side effects or the serious impact of getting COVID, particularly in leading to death for a lot of folks. So that caused a lot of anxiety. And a lot of uncertainty, not knowing how long this was going to last, not knowing what the impact on our daily lives was going to be, and that constantly changes. So it really was an emotional roller coaster. So on top of being underprepared and overworked with this new situation that we hadn't experienced before, there really were a lot of mental health issues for all folks on college campuses. We had to figure out how to deal with that and manage that. And when students were on campus, there was reduced revenue. There was a decrease in tuition. The students were choosing not to attend college anymore or university. But the biggest impact was on auxiliary revenue. So housing. Students were no longer in housing, so they were not contributing to the funds in that way. Students weren't using dining halls, so there were no additional revenue coming from that. And with students not on campus, there really wasn't a way, or at least an ethical way, for institutions to charge student fees for participation in campus recreation or participation in student organizations. And so most of this auxiliary revenue impacted student affairs work because most offices don't receive their budgets through tuition. They receive it through these student fees or through these auxiliary revenues. So money had diminished dramatically. Some staff were laid off or put on temporary layoff. And so this huge drop in cash flow really had an impact on the work of the institution, and particularly student affairs. And then all of this had a huge impact on professional development itself. Most of us were used to attending one, maybe two national conferences each year, or attending a regional conference. And professional development, for the most part, was related to in-person activities, meeting together for a conference or for a workshop. But with limited funding, pretty much no funding, because when budgets were reduced, professional development was one of the first things cut. There was limited time because staff were overworked. So there really wasn't the space and the time to actually attend any professional development opportunities, even if they had the funding to do that. And there's also some changing issues that are that really are the source of professional development, different issues that come up from time to time. But now there are a whole new set of skills and knowledge that were needed that impacted what professional development was being provided in terms of topics. And there was this push towards virtual events because, again, people couldn't come together in person. Virtual events are much cheaper to put on than in-person events. So they were, many were free for a long time or at very reduced costs. So I think that's a positive that came out of this because these virtual events provided access for more people. But again, as I mentioned with this, being with students on campus in that same space, that interpersonal connection was missing. The conversations that would happen at these conferences between sessions, in the lobby of a hotel, were not happening because folks would tune in at the time the virtual event, the virtual conference or workshop or webinar started, and they would log off after that. So they weren't those organic conversations which happen at conferences or when people are in the same physical space. So let's take a little bit look at the professional development and student affairs after COVID. So what will have an impact on as we move forward? What will we keep based on what's been happening and what might be new? I always suggest that folks take a look at both competencies and standards because that can really drive and should be the foundation for professional development. ACPA and NASPA have professional competencies for individuals. There are 10 competency areas that identify what types of skills and knowledge individual student affairs practitioners should have. And those are great ways to provide a foundation for professional development opportunities. And CAS also has standards for professional practice. So these are a little bit different. Rather than being the skills and knowledge for individuals, these are the standards that a functional area such as residence activities or student conduct should have while they're doing their work. And so I think both the professional competencies and the CAS standards can provide some starting places for professional development, both in terms of what should be offered, but also from the individual perspective, thinking about what types of skills and knowledge or what should I know about. So as I seek out professional development opportunities, the competencies and the standards can provide a guidepost to identifying what professional development opportunities I may want to attend. So these are the 10 competency areas for ACPA and NASPA. So advising and supporting, assessment, evaluation, and research, law, policy, and governance, leadership, organizational and human resources, personal ethical foundations, social justice and inclusion, student learning and development, technology, and values, philosophy, and history. There's a document that can be easily found on the internet by searching ACPA and NASPA professional competencies, which outline each one of these more specifically. And there's also a set of rubrics which break down each one of these competency areas into individual dimensions, which can be used for a self-assessment guide to identify where one person may fit within the dimensions on any one of these competency areas, but also could be used for evaluation purposes. So definitely check out those competency areas if you've not already. And CAS is a little bit different. So CAS is actually a consortium of 40 higher education associations within North America. There are 48 functional area standards, and a functional area is a department or a unit such as residence life or campus activities. And so the standards are for each one of those functional areas. And then there are also 3 cross-functional frameworks. And so these are issues that transcend any one functional area, such as first-year experience or student well-being. And so these frameworks are similar in structure to the functional area standard. They provide some guidance on how to go about addressing those issues, but they're not just for one functional area. And both the functional area standards and the cross-functional frameworks have corresponding self-assessment guides. So these are worksheets that provide some guides on how to assess how well one is doing within each of these functional areas or addressing the cross-functional issues. So check out the 10th edition of the CAS Professional Standards for Higher Education book, which provides more detail on each one of those functional areas. But you can also purchase the standards and the self-assessment guide for each individual functional area. So if you don't need the book for all of them and you're working in one of these units, you can just purchase the standards and the self-assessment guides for that one unit. So let's take a look at the different opportunities around professional development, knowing that the competencies and the standards can provide a foundation for not only what we learn, but what is provided. ACPA and NASPA both were back in person this year in the spring of 2022. There were virtual opportunities for both of those. And also the IASIS Global Summit is happening virtually this spring in next month in May. And this IASIS stands for the International Association for Student Affairs and Services, which is a global association for people working in student affairs in countries around the world. Then each functional area has their own conferences as well. So CUI, which is the Association of College and University Housing Officers International, NACADA, which is the Global Academic Advising Network, and NACA, which is the National Association of Campus Activities. And there are more functional areas that have their own professional conferences focused just on that functional area. And those happen throughout the year. And as I mentioned, as similar to ACPA and NASPA, these functional area conferences are trying to meet again in person, but are also providing some virtual opportunities. Now, conferences are professional opportunities which really provide a lot of different individual sessions, but institutes are a little bit different. Institutes have a specific curriculum. So they're not just these individual sessions around different topics, but they focus on one topic, and there is some scaffolded learning that happens with each one of these. Some institutes, some examples are the ACPA Student Affairs Assessment Institute, the NASPA Institute for Aspiring Vice Presidents, a CUI, a Mid-Level Leadership Institute, the CAUCUS Student Conduct Institute, and there are more. But again, they're similar in terms of length, typically 2 to 3 days as a conference, but really focusing on one topic. And what we saw in the pandemic is a huge shift to webinars, because again, it's easier and cheaper to provide virtual webinars than it is in-person conferences. And also webinars can be adapted and created very quickly. So there little planning is needed. So webinars were great during the pandemic because we could adapt and create topics that were needed at that moment, for folks and be able to provide those very quickly. Some webinars that have been in the past or upcoming are You Are a Data Person, provided by NASPA based on that book, You Are a Data Person by Amelia Parnell. Trauma-informed advising, inclusive assessment, and identity conscious leadership. Again, you can check out the ACPA or NASPA website, as well as any of the functional area of professional organizations for webinars that they're providing on an ongoing basis. The other great thing about webinars is that they're often recorded. And so if a webinar is scheduled for a specific time of day that someone's not able to attend, they can still get access to the recording afterwards, which is almost as good as attending in person. During the pandemic, there was also a bigger push for podcasts. So audio recordings of conversations. These were more interview format rather than a presentation. But these have been really helpful and provide additional professional development. The nice thing about podcasts is people can listen to them while they're driving to work, while they're on the treadmill, while they're exercising, while they're taking a walk, because you just need to listen rather than listen and watch. Some of the popular podcasts in the United States are Student Affairs Now, which is a webcast addressing various topics within higher education. They typically come out each week. Speaking of college, Leading Improvement in Higher Education, which is an assessment podcast. Higher Ed Now addresses topical issues within higher education. Times Higher Education publication has web podcasts, as well as Inside Higher Education, which is a news publication, online news publication that provides updated higher education news, but they have webinars related to topics that they're publishing. The other area for professional development are related to credentials. So actually getting some type of certificate or degree within higher education and student affairs. There are many professional certificates that are available in the United States by attending a certain number of classes. There are graduate certificates, which are a little bit more sophisticated because you'll actually be taking graduate courses, where the professional certificates are usually built around institutes where graduate certificates and courses and degrees are utilized graduate courses at an accredited university. Books are also a great way to do some professional development, especially one out by yourself. The biggest publishers in the United States for student affairs are Routledge, Stylus, and Wiley. You can go to any of their websites and just search for student affairs and find various publications that may be informative for the work that you're doing. There are also professional journals, and the journals will have individual research articles where the books may include some research. The journals are focused specifically on empirical research. One of the most highly regarded journals in the United States is the Journal of College Student Development, published by ACPA College Student Educators International. Another one is the Journal of Student Affairs Research and Practice, published by NASPA. And then there are also New Directions in Student Services. And then there are specific functional area or topical journals, such as the Journal of Leadership Education. You may be able to access these journals free through your university library, like I am able to. So I don't need to be a member of these organizations or pay for these journals. I can access these through the library. So those are some of the professional development opportunities, some of the topics that I think will be hot. As I mentioned earlier, the one positive that came out of the pandemic was this big shift to virtual events. Actually, my institution, New England College, will be hosting a virtual assessment conference in early June that we had a couple of years ago. It used to be in person, but when the pandemic struck, we shifted to online. And the great benefit is that folks around the world are able to participate, not just people who live geographically close to New Hampshire. And so I think that's going to be a positive moving forward. There'll be a lot more virtual events that will be easy for folks to attend. They'll have access to the recordings afterwards, and they're relatively cheaper to participate in as well. But now that we're moving a little bit past the pandemic, moving more into the endemic stage, a lot of professional organizations are getting back to in-person events, and I think student affairs folks who are really people are looking forward to reconnecting with their colleagues after a 2-year hiatus. So let's talk a little bit about optimal staffing in student affairs. One of the things I was asked to talk about today was, what is the right number of staff or to student ratio in different functional areas? Well, honestly, there's not a specific number. The CAS standards, which, as I mentioned earlier, outline professional standards for practice within student affairs. What they say is that the functional must identify level of staffing necessary to achieve mission and goals. So it's not a one size fits all. It really depends on a lot of different considerations, including mission and goals of the institution. So what is the mission? What are the goals? If the mission is more liberal arts, there may be more staffing. Student enrollment is probably one of the biggest considerations. The more students that are at an institution, the more staff should be there. Also, when there are more students, there's more revenue to support the staff. Student needs. Some institutions have higher needs. There is an institution here in the United States for neurodiverse students, so students with autism or AADH, and they have more staff needed for advising specifically. And then student needs. So depending on what the student needs are, they really have a lot of different funding for that as well. And then financial resources is the biggest one. So really thinking about what are the resources needed and what are the resources available. My institution is a very small private institution. We're tuition driven. And so we don't have a lot of resources. So we have many one-person offices on our campus. Now we've grown from about 1,000 now close to 3,000 on-campus students, and our staffing hasn't increased that much at all. Partly because we're still trying to build up those financial resources. But again, these are the various considerations for identifying what the number of staff is. One tool that people in the United States do use is what's called benchmarking. So identifying some similar institutions in terms of size, in terms of mission, in terms of geography, and identifying what are the staffing in various functional areas, and then doing some comparison to that. For example, at a previous institution when I directed assessment, we wanted to really push to have more psychological counselors on campus. And to do that, we did some benchmarking with similar institutions. And we found out that we had fewer counselors per student than other institutions did. And we used that information to petition the president to increase the funding for psychological counselors. So we increased the number of our counselors by 2 because of that benchmarking process. So as I get to the end of this presentation, I hope it's been helpful. I hope it provides some context for how the challenges during the pandemic both influenced professional development during the pandemic and how it's going to influence professional development moving out of the pandemic, but also a little bit of background and guidance on how staffing should be in student affairs. Again, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you. I hope that the session has been informative. Feel free to reach out to me at my email or check out my website for more information. I'm happy to answer any questions via email that folks might have. Enjoy the rest of the conference.